And because they took their sight off of God and put their sight on things of this world and of selfish things and of forgetting those who really needed help in society, their society began to crumble. An army started seeing that this kingdom was weak and they could come in and they could plunder and take everything that this kingdom had. This temple that they had, which was full of gold and precious metal and silver and jewels, looked very nice if you were the Assyrians or if you were the Babylonians from the outside. This land that they had, very valuable land with the Jordan River flowing through it, was very, very, very costly, very valuable. And so as they took their eyes off of God, as they did what was evil in the sight of God, that's how it says, they did what was evil in the sight of God. If you read the Old Testament, you'll read that over and over and over again. This king came along, and this king wasn't like the good king. This king did what was evil in the sight of God, over and over and over again. That began to add up over time. Assyria came in and took the northern kingdom, and then before they knew it, Babylon came in about 100 or so years later and took the southern kingdom into captivity. They were gone. The land of their grandparents and great-grandparents was no longer theirs. They were captured by a foreign army, by foreign people, and they found themselves sort of like slaves in another country. Now, this capturing wasn't just being exiled, but it resulted in people being murdered and killed and families being split up. And probably for them thinking that their God, the Creator God, had been defeated. Because if Assyria came in and captured them, that meant that Assyria's gods were more powerful than our God. If Babylon came in and captured them, Babylon's gods were more powerful than our God. This was a crisis of faith for them. Maybe God was destroyed. And so here they were in a foreign land, away from what their ancestors knew, wondering if their faith was even worth anything anymore. And Isaiah comes to them and gives them this message. Now, I imagine Tiger, who's not a Christian, or doesn't profess to be anyway, probably feels a little bit like Israel did at this time. Exiled. I mean, literally, the guy, as far as I know, recently has sort of escaped and has gone away. Definitely exiled from his family because of the choices that he made in his life. Exiled from his children, exiled from the peace that maybe he once had. Probably feels a little bit like Israel. In fact, anyone who has lived a life that puts themselves in a place where they are doing things that are evil in the eyes of God, things that are selfish, things where we only are thinking of ourselves, probably feel a little exiled ourselves, a little like we've left God, a little like we're away from God in a foreign land, alone and without any help or any comfort from God. So you have these situations of Tiger and of Isaiah, and maybe even you. Now, maybe your evil that you've done is not something as public as Tiger or has the same kind of consequences as what happened to the Israelites, but maybe you've felt exiled from God, away from God, far from God. Things that you've done, surely God couldn't take you back. Surely God couldn't make a recovery for your country, for your life. Maybe you felt a little bit like that too. Exiled in a way. And the prophet Isaiah says words of hope and of encouragement and of peace. And one person wrote this: God is always able to propose a fresh new set of possibilities, no matter how miserable and downtrodden our circumstances have made us. In short, God's love is powerful in its capacity to empower. It empowers by forever opening up a constructive way forward, a way that may not completely redeem the immediate circumstances, but prevents them from having the final say. Isn't this what Brett Hume was offering to Tiger? It wasn't so much that God was going to just clean house and make everything better and that the relationship with his wife and his children would be wonderful and as if nothing happened. It's not cheap grace. Please hear that. It's not cheap grace. God forgives us, but we live with the choices we've made. However, as this says here, God will redeem the immediate circumstances and prevents them from having the final say in our life. Now, that's the good news. That the choices we made and the bad things we've done, well, they will impact us and they will impact others. But God, Christ, the love of God, prevents them from having the final say-so in our lives. You know, Christianity is not a faith that looks back on the bad choices that we've made and on the things that we've done in our life. But Christianity is a faith that looks forward in the hope of a resurrection, in the hope of God redeeming us, knowing that God loves us, that God cares for us. And as Isaiah said, you are precious in my sight. These are words from God. You are precious in my sight. You are honored, and I love you. I was thinking about these words from God. I love you. Those little messages that the kids opened earlier that talked about putting ourselves in a place where we could hear from God in a very intimate way, hearing the words from God, I love you, be mine, I love you. And I thought about that. And I thought, you know, a lot of times when we hear somebody say, you know, God loves you, we kind of go, yeah, we know. We've kind of heard it so much that it just sort of just goes in one ear and out the other sometimes. I love you, yeah, I know. I thought about the Israelites and the message that came to them in the midst of their exile. And Isaiah says to them, God says, I love you. And that message was so important to them that that book was preserved for 2,500 years. Through exile, through famine, through destruction. Eventually Rome comes in and destroys the temple again. Yet that book was valuable to them because of those words, I love you, the message that's in it. So important that it comes to us today, 2,500 years later. They heard these words, I love you, from God, and they didn't just let it fly over them and pass over them, but they preserved it so that you could hear it today, so that their children and their children's children, and on and on and on, down to those who would believe in the coming Messiah, Jesus Christ. Those of us sitting here today receive this book because those words were so important. As Israel was carried into exile, these pictures here show the Assyrians taking them off. These are ancient pictures. And the child walking, they have all their belongings on their back. They heard the words, I love you. They were so important to them that despite all this, despite all they were going through, we have those words today preserved for us. I think about John Wesley, and one of my favorite stories about John Wesley. John Wesley always preached inside of the church because in that day to go outside and to preach out in the fields, to preach out on the city streets or wherever, was considered crude. It was not something that a respectable Anglican priest would do. You always preached inside the church building. However, his friend George Whitefield was out preaching in the fields, and he would come back to him and say, John, you would not believe. All these people are responding to my message. These are people who are not coming to church, but they're hearing about God's love, and they're responding to what I'm saying. And John finally decided, he said in his journal, I made the decision to become more vile. To become more vile. And I went out in the fields and I proclaimed the love of God to the people. And there's a story about him going to the beasties. They called them the beasties because these were the people who worked in the coal mines in London at the time. 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week, never saw the sun, always lived in darkness, were the bottom of society. They knew that by taking a job in the coal mine, their lives were going to be shortened, but there was no other option for them. They knew they would live half as long as everybody else. Men, women, and children.